Today is our speaker. I'm going to cut this short because we don't have much time left. Gary grew up near Lansing, Michigan, went to college at Michigan State, and then he has a wife and two daughters. One of them is a medical doctor, and the other teaches pharmacy at the University of South Florida. Okay, he's been a colonel in the reserves for many years. I can't read my last note. Oh, he came to Purdue and got his doctorate in agronomy, and he's been there ever since. He liked it here, so he never left. Gary?
All right. Well, they don't frequently hire their own graduates, but I'm very fortunate. I don't know what I'm very glad they did. I don't know whether the feeling is mutual, but it's been a great place to be part of extension and part of teaching. One of the things I do is teach land use, soils and land use. So usually I talk about soils, but today we're going to talk some about land, as to that is the ownership and management of it and so forth, and some of the ways that we got to the way we perceive land in our present society. Land can be a lot of different things to different people, as you can see here. And Jim's got a bunch of handouts. Can't have an extension meeting without handouts. So we'll have all of these things on PowerPoint for you. But basically today I'd like to talk about various types of ownership and eventually end up with how we perceive it here in North America. Now, tribal, ancient Israel, feudal Europe, various kinds of collective styles of ownership and so forth. Tribal is one that's very variable depending on the situation. A lot of times tribes are pushed or pulled as a result of environmental stress as well as the other tribes that are in the area. Oftentimes you'll see going back and forth. Oftentimes major features or boundaries such as mountain ranges and that sort of thing. The land allocation is often by chief or by council. There's lots and lots of raids, typically from one tribe to another. It's very, very common. Certainly was true in North America here prior to the Europeans' arrival as well as afterwards. As close as we would get to ownership as we would think of it are hunting territories. One of the dramatic examples that I give of tribal strength and that sort of thing is the story of Queen Boudica, a Celtic queen in what is now England, in the eastern part of England. And you'll see that various of the tribes ended up with a fairly formal way of governance. This was true of the Iceni in eastern England, around the city of York, or in that general area, if you're familiar with the geography of England. The succession and so forth oftentimes would go through more of the male heir. Land transfers, however, could be made. Now, when the Romans arrived there, they decided that perhaps that wasn't quite how they were going to do it. And in one of the classic cases of the strength between tribal groups is the situation with Queen Boudica, where her husband passed away, leaving the land half to the Romans and half to the tribe. The Romans, being the stronger part of the group, decided perhaps they'd like it all. Thank you very much. And what I have, we don't know exactly what Queen Boudica looked like, but there was one striking feature of her, and that's that she had very beautiful red hair. I always tell my male students, do not make red-haired women angry. This is not a good idea. Anyway, they did attack the Romans, burned London, burned a number of other cities as well, and then eventually, however, because of the strength of the Roman army, they were able to prevail. And it shows that justice never has anything to do with tribal arrangements on land. Ancient Israel is a fascinating way of doing it because they had dual control. They had both a king as well as a high priest. Basically, the high priest gave the king kind of an evaluation of how he was doing, if you will. The land was distributed after the conquest of Canaan. In their perception, all the land belonged to God, and there were ancestral boundaries, and all of you have seen it probably in Sunday school maps and so forth. I'll show you that wasn't quite exactly how it worked, but that is how we perceive of it. Every 50 years, the land all reverted to the original owners. This was the Jubilee, if you've heard some of the songs and so forth about the Jubilee. Anyway, everything went back as it was to the original owners. There was a Sabbath for the land every 7 years, and women, of course, were allowed to inherit under some circumstances. Now, as this is the map that all of you saw in Sunday school and so forth, this is what the actual archaeological evidence would suggest for where the actual tribes existed. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this is the first time that I'm aware of that there were limitations placed on kings. And very carefully in the law of Moses, the king could do some things but not others. If you recall, one of the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel as compared to Judah, but they both operated under similar arrangements. King Ahab of Israel wanted very much a very beautiful vineyard that belonged to one of his citizens. The individual there decided he would not sell it because it was part of his ancestral heritage. And so the king was in a funk because he couldn't take the land. It was forbidden because Naboth owned it. Now Jezebel, his wife, was a Phoenician. She was not troubled by the same sorts of little niceties of the law that was true for Ahab. And so she got a couple of false witnesses, and after the execution of Naboth, Ahab had his vineyard. Now, feudalism in England is part of what heritage that we sort of come from. In their system, basically the king owned everything. Then he distributed to vassals and so forth underneath him, William the Conqueror and so forth. And basically they were loyal to the king because their wealth came from him. And there was sort of a pecking order. It started up here with the king. I suppose all of you have seen that sort of pyramid of birds, perhaps. Well, it's the same sort of deal. Anyway, the king is up here, and then he's got some barons and so forth, and some lords underneath them. And then, of course, this is where my ancestors fit very comfortably. And so each one of them served it. The idea was that land produced wealth, and it produced wealth by squeezing those who were at the bottom and squeezing the money up towards the top. Now, we still have vestiges of that in our present-day government here, and that would be property taxes. The concept is that if you have owned things, then you're wealthy. Well, the idea, of course, is I ask my students, how much land does Bill Gates own? And, of course, the answer is not much. Now, if you look at a farmer who owns a lot of stuff but doesn't make a lot of money, he gets an opportunity to pay on all the stuff he's got, but Bill Gates doesn't get to pay for what's in his head. Well, anyway, that's still left. Now, obviously, since the king was in charge of everything, there was huge opportunities for excess. And if there's an opportunity for government excess, will it happen? Well, I think so, eventually. This shows you some of the ways that the king could take advantage of his subjects. And there are various kinds of things you can look it over and so forth. Obviously, this made people very unhappy. And King John is the one, and there's a definite reason. If any of you want to read some things after you get done reading about Queen Boudica, You can read about King John. There is a reason why there's never been a second King John in England. You talk about an international fink and bad guy. This guy wrote the book on how to be Mr. Bad, and he was. Finally, they got up to their chins with him and said, that's it. They confronted him at this swampy area here along the Thames River and said, this is it, Mr. King. We like having you as the king, sort of, but you're going to have to change your ways. Now, they forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. Of course, he immediately violated it, and about 6 months later, he was dead anyway. Now, his kid, who took over from him, had to then re-sign this thing as well as add to it the Charter of the Forest, which allowed people to use the forest. In the past, it was simply used by the king exclusively. I find it fascinating that today, with the 800th anniversary of it just a few days ago, that here at Runnymede, this is this little swampy area where they caught him, the only monument there is a United States monument. The British don't have a monument there because they don't have a written constitution. We do. I don't know how much good it is, but we do. We got a constitution, and it's written out as to what's supposed to happen, and it limits the power of government. Now, in England, whatever Parliament decides today is what they're going to do. They have no written constitution that limits their authority. I'd be nervous if I was them, but fortunately, my relatives left. Okay, collective ownership. There's a couple different kinds. There's the forced kind, which would see the centrally planned economies, the Soviet Union being a prime example of that. And you also can have voluntary associations, and Israel would be the classic example of that. Basically, in the Soviet system, they had a couple different kinds of farms and so forth. They had a collective farm that was basically peasant families working together. The land, of course, was all owned by the state. They did have some small private tracts where they could do this, that, and the other thing. They also had state farms that were very large, usually single purpose. They were controlled by the state, and of course, they were essentially factories in the field. Now, there were 70% of the farmland, more than in the United States, but only 80% of the yield. Now, there are lots of different reasons for that, why the U.S. farmers were so much more productive. I always tell my students that they'd had a lot better luck, instead of this poster, if they'd had Maria Sharapova as one of their collective members. Now, there were lots of advantages to this, you would imagine, and they imagined it too. And that is, you could use the latest production methods, which was true, a very efficient use of equipment because you had so much for a given area, a guaranteed full employment. Farm workers could accumulate lots of money. It's interesting that farm workers in the Soviet Union had lots and lots of money, but very little to spend it on. So it would accumulate in the bank and so forth. And with our system, if you folks wanted to, Ted, if you wanted to go spend a night for $2,000 a night at the Waldorf Astoria or the Ritz-Carlton and schmooze with people, you could do it. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could do it. In the Soviet Union, you couldn't because you were restricted. Those hotels were not available to people coming in. Now, what were the disadvantages? Well, there are lots of environmental problems that were associated with it, mostly from it being too far north. Let me tell you, if you picture your beach resort to have the same climate as Cleveland, Ohio, you've got a problem. And so there were organizational problems. They emphasized industry. Lots and lots of storage problems because very little in the way of roads and so forth, farm-to-market roads, and of course all kinds of mismanagement. Now, Israel is another sort of thing. Again, they had the same kinds of collective situations, but these were all voluntary. And they made the desert literally bloom. There were the kibbutz, which was a kind of a farm that was sort of a collective settlement. Moshav is more like the collective farm of the Soviet Union. And they were very successful. When they began, if you recall, the background of Zionism in the early part of the 20th century, they began around Lake Kinneret, or what we would think of perhaps biblically as the Sea of Galilee. Mostly Jews from Eastern Europe and Russia. The idea was to foster mutual aid and social justice. And you can see some of the things that they did. One of the big problems was that they rotated jobs. You can imagine how inefficient that would be. Imagine, Jim, in your bank, rotating tellers and vice presidents and whatnot. Maybe you did it. Okay, well. Well, let me tell you, it doesn't work very well. You maybe already know that. Now, to start with, it was not opposed by the Muslims because it was a good deal, for at least for the Ottomans that were in charge of the area, because it added economic development. It certainly filled a need for family. They were financially quite good. It was certainly preferable to being murdered in Russia and the like. Now, what are the problems now? Well, of course, if any of you have tried to get a group of people to do something, you can find out that sometimes they're not very nimble in terms of change, not very oriented to that. Witness our song. I mean, I think we've changed our song finally. But this is the fifth. I've been here too long. It's probably the fifth time we've changed the song. Oh, pardon me. Okay. Anyway, individuals that come into this are oftentimes more endearing of the system rather than they are of the results. They're more oriented to collectivism than they are to whether it works or not. The talented people are very reluctant to adopt this. They have lots of concerns about children raised, and this is one of the real problems here, that the people coming in, these young ladies here in the officer candidate school here are Sephardic Jews who come from the Middle East, and they are under no illusions of the benefits of collectivism. And they are slowly but surely making up the majority of the people, rather than those of these young ladies who are from Eastern Europe, who perhaps still harbor some endearment of collectivism. Now, in the United States, we have lots of interesting things. This is our first sanitation law in Virginia. You can imagine that was kind of not a very pleasant existence. Planning was very central to it. You had to bring everything with you. Mayflower Compact, if you've never read it, I would suggest it. Some of my students have never read it, and they get an opportunity to. But it's a very interesting document. Most of the colonies were commercial ventures. If you have some curiosity, I would highly recommend that you take a look at the Law of the Indies. This was a very interesting Spanish-based system of settlement, of colonialism, if you will, written by the court of King Philip II. And they fell short on some things. They didn't treat the natives quite like it was suggested in there, by quite a ways. But the individual design of the towns, they followed it scrupulously. My students read an English translation of this, and the penalty phase is fascinating, because it gives you all the list of things and then goes into the penalty phase. And it says, if you don't follow this, we're going to kill you and confiscate all your money. You'd be surprised how meticulously they followed that city plan. Okay, Savannah, Georgia was the first planned city in the United States. You can see here the general system that they used. There's 24 different squares that are here. 22 of them still exist. But the general idea was to have a park in the middle of housing here. There's 10 houses here, 10 houses here, 10 houses here, and then areas for public things, churches, schools, that sort of thing. Washington, D.C. was formed on a plan. It degraded quite considerably, and so as a consequence, it came in for urban renewal, if you will, and they took out all of these places in this area that had become slums and started all over again with the mall. Now, early as we began to settle the United States, it became clear that something needed to be done about relationships between landowners. there were conflicts between individuals. In most cases, residents were given priority, but not always. But it was always a matter of litigation and so forth, and the results were quite inconsistent. The standard that was used was like a pig in a parlor. In other words, it was a nuisance that would be difficult to curb. Despite the popularity of Vietnamese pot-bellied pigs, they're probably not the best pet. If you raise a pig in a parlor, the pig would not change, but the parlor certainly would. The right thing in the wrong place. Now, what happened was we got started with a city beautiful movement. This went through a series of things. One of the things that is most celebrated, not that it was the origin of it, but it's the most celebrated thing and most notable, is the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And many of you have probably been on the grounds of the Columbian Exposition. The University of Chicago is located there, the Midway and all that sort of thing. They introduced, it celebrated the 400th anniversary, well, they were late by 1 year, after all it is Chicago. And they celebrated the 400th anniversary of the discovery of the New World. And they brought in all kinds of new stuff. Shredded wheat, cream of wheat, juicy fruit gum, brownies, chocolate brownies, Ferris wheels, and zippers. And all these different things got started. But the important thing was that in this exposition, they showed that cities did not have to be ugly. And many of them were by this time. So it's there that you start looking then at land use controls. We started in New York City, although a number of other cities can claim that sort of distinction. San Francisco had some early zoning and so forth. Land use itself is a state responsibility. Local government can be enabled to arrange land use and so forth based on the police powers. And there are 5 police powers and so forth: public safety, public health, morality, peace and quiet, law and order. And so every law that restricts the use of land must comport with one of these 5 principles. The police power derives from the 10th Amendment, which says anything that's not delegated specifically to the United States by the Constitution of the federal government, nor prohibited to it, is reserved for the states or to the people. And so that is why we don't have the FBI setting up a speed trap out here on Lindbergh Road. We could, with a lot of the traffic there, we could probably put a pretty good dent in the budget if we started an FBI speed trap going right to the federal government. Okay, now we think about private property with the owner as sovereign, if you will, and this could be difficult in some cases. Early zoning is very important, whether it was in New York, San Francisco, you name it. It didn't cost anything because everything was open. Now everything's not so open, and so when you change one thing, then other things change as well. So it's a very contentious issue. But as population increases and so forth, and the differences in nuisances and so forth become more important. Now, the idea of changing this becomes very contentious because in many cases when you change the designation of use, you also change the value. And there's enough court legislation or court decisions to suggest that the fact that a zoning change reduces the value, unless it doesn't reduce it to absolutely nothing, is not necessarily something that you can sue for compensation. So, in order for zoning to be constitutional, it has to serve a stated purpose. It has to be consistently applied, so you can't make a special exception for your cousin. It has to be impartially applied, so you can't restrict somebody you don't like. And it also has to be enacted by elected officials, so you can vote the bums out if they do something that you don't like. So that is a short introduction to land use and the concepts of land. So we start out from the very basic sort of tribal stuff, very rudimentary, to the very careful things that we have nowadays. Okay. I don't know if we have time for a question or so. Perhaps not.
Yeah.